what is race to begin with?
Wow, that's an easy one. So that's a great question, and it depends. I'm not like an expert on the history and anthropology of race, but my understanding from the research I did for this book was that basically scientists and anthropologists, basically the 19th century, divided the world into different spheres and said people from Europe and nearby areas are Caucasian, people from East Asia are what we now call Asia, but they would use the now offensive term Mongoloid. People from Africa are what they would call Negroes, what they would say, and wasn't really clear exactly where Native Americans fit, and those were your basic categories. Or and in the United States, this was basically correlated with color. So right, we have basically black for people of African descent, uh, yellow for people of Asian descent, red for people of indigenous descent, and white for people of European or Middle Eastern descent. And those classifications, I think it's fair to say there's a consensus among experts nowadays that they weren't really based on more than you know very crude classifications based on how people looked and the prejudices of the day, but they became really ingrained in our society such that when the government itself was classifying people for the census and whatnot, they often used very similar kinds of classifications. And then when they formalized them, even after the civil rights era, they actually stuck pretty closely, not exactly, but pretty closely to these historically dubious kinds of racial definitions. But if you ask me what is race, I would actually agree with those who say it's primarily a social construct. There is obviously some correlation between what we call race and people's genetic origins, but genetics, it turns out, is much, much, much more complicated than these racial classifications are. You could divide Europeans, for example, into 8 different basic genetic groups, while we think of in the United States people of African descent as all being quote unquote black or African American, and think of it as sort of a coherent singular category. Africa actually has the most genetic diversity of any continent in the world because humans, most scientists think humans started there, say the most time to have genetic diversity. And within Africa itself, even among what we call Black Africans, Ethiopians and Somalis, for example, have incredible number of internal ethnic groups. Some of whom are more related to other Black Africans, some of whom are more related to Arabs and Jews. So it's actually very complicated. So again, we have folk notions of race, scientific notions of race, and then I think actual what the evidence actually shows is that race is not really that useful in a scientific or anthropological sense, but instead we should be looking at genetic clusters. And of course, the closer people were living, the closer one group lived to the other, the more likely they were to be genetically related. But that makes a continuum rather than sharp differentials between people like in Africa versus people in Europe.
Right. The line that I've used and the way I think of this is that race is a social construct inspired by a biological reality, much in the way that the concept of a month is just an arbitrary number of days, but it's sort of loosely inspired by the idea, the time it takes the month to complete the lunar cycle. Sorry, the moon to complete the lunar cycle. It's like so race in that sense. We have these categories that are loosely inspired by a fact, which is that different groups migrated out of Africa 50,000 years ago and evolved to demonstrate all of the differences that account for why I look different than you. You know, why my skin is this way and your skin is that way. And we take that fact and then build these socially constructed categories inspired by it, but not actually precisely tracking it. And your book is like it's a reservoir of example after example after example in which the social construct um, so clearly reveals itself to be absurd and completely arbitrary, and yet it really makes a difference which box you are able to check if you're a business owner applying for a government contract, which can be very lucrative, if you are applying to a college, um, if you are a policeman or a firefighter, many of the cases in your book uh, pertain to those professions, applying for a promotion, and there's a program to promote minorities, right? So all of these things really make a difference in people's lives, and whether you qualify them hinges on facts about your life and about, you know, the way these things have been defined that are totally arbitrary and totally depart from any whatever is real that population geneticists are studying.
Right. And, there's two different issues, and especially I have a chapter on how race is used in medicine, especially comes up there. One issue is, does race itself mean anything? And as you suggested, and as I suggested earlier, there is some correlation between race and genetics. It's a very crude and imperfect one, so it's not something you really want to rely on for anything important, but at least obviously we could generally tell the difference between someone who looks like they have of African descent and someone who looks like they're of European descent. But in the case of, then there's a second issue of, well, once, how does the U.S. classify people by race? And that gets even more arbitrary and absurd, and it's not even crude. It's just wildly weird and ridiculous in a lot of the so-called racial categories. So for a variety of reasons, for example, the Asian American category includes everyone from people who live up to the western border of Pakistan and China, all the way to the Philippines. Now, Pakistanis and Chinese people have nothing in common with each other, really, and in turn have very little in common with Filipinos. Just if you wanted to use the old-fashioned anthropological racial categories, Indians and Pakistanis and so forth, South Asians or Caucasians. There's a lot of genetic diversity within South Asia. East Asians are a separate group, and most Filipinos are Austronesians and are more related to people from Tahiti and whatnot in Hawaii than they are to other Asians. But we just lump them all together. They have different religions, different cultures. They look different. They have different histories. They often have mutual enmity over the centuries with each other. But the U.S. government just said, okay, you're all Asian. And in the United States, they have different levels of socioeconomic success, different places, different geographic concentrations, and just sort of lumping them all together in a category of Asian. The Asian, using race in general is problematic, but then you have these weird categories that aren't even racial categories, that just government creates pseudo racial categories.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the history of how the big five racial categories came to be in America. And and we should just take a moment to recognize that we tend to take the categories we're born into for granted as if there's something normal about them. But anytime we hear how race and ethnicity has been categorized in the past or in other places, we get this distinct feeling of how just insanely weird the categorization is. But we fail to bring that sense of weirdness to our modern received categories, even though they're actually just as weird. So I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but there used to be distinctions between, say, an octoroon and a quadroon. This is someone with like 1/8 black ancestry and 1/4 black ancestry. And these categories and words seemed totally normal and not humorous at all, just as normal as black and Asian and Hispanic sound today. But we look back at them and they sound totally absurd. So I want to invite, as we talk about these categories, I want to invite the listeners to try to conjure up that feeling of weirdness. Imagine that you're kind of an anthropologist from Mars visiting America and just studying from afar how we categorize things as we go through this. But so with that said, can you give I mean, I know there's a very long history here, but maybe a somewhat shortened summary of how the big five categories, that is Asian and Pacific Islander, American Indian or Alaskan Native, Black, White, and Hispanic, how these five categories crystallized between the 50s and roughly 1977.
Sure. And let me say that now that I've written this book, the categories I sort of took for granted because we all just use them every day without thinking about it, now all seem weird to me, which makes my life a little bit more weird and complicated because I'll see things like people from India, on Twitter saying "you white people" about something, and I know that historically speaking, it was just as it was really just happenstance that people from India wound up being classified as Asian rather than white, and but for a really um, random historical circumstance, uh, it would be like other people would be berating the Indians for being among the white group rather than vice versa. But in any event, what happened in the 1950s, we obviously had a history of race and racism in the U.S. We historically had obviously the African American, or historically the Negro or colored classification, the white classification. That was the most important one, obviously, given slavery and then Jim Crow and so forth. Once Asian immigration started, we of course added on the census a category first for Chinese, then for Japanese, and then also for Filipinos, which were the three major groups. And after World War II, I think there was a sense, wow, we are the civil rights movement is really getting into gear. We're starting to want to limit discrimination, and we see what happened in the U.S. with Jim Crow, with Japanese internment, with anti-Chinese legislation. We see the Holocaust happening after when the Germans had, just like we had our octoroons and quadroons, they had their Mischlings and all that for Jews. Maybe we should just abolish these things altogether. And I think that's where the intellectual trends are running. That was considered the liberal progressive, egalitarian ideal. But what happened was in the 1950s, the U.S. government started trying to enforce anti-discrimination executive orders against federal government contractors. And there's a lot of defense contracts in the 50s, a lot of money flowing into contracts. And to their credit, the government officials at the time said, we don't want all these big companies that we're contracted with to be excluding black workers and Jewish workers and so forth. So so presidents passed executive orders, and they asked the contractors to name to list how many employees they have of each group. And for a variety of reasons, Jews were originally on, but they dropped off. It was partly African Americans obviously had suffered the most discrimination. So there's two things going on. The first thing that was going on was, which groups do we consider analogous to African Americans? And there was a case to be made that Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican Americans, even though they were historically actually put in the white category, actually many of them were dark skinned and suffered at least somewhat similar types of discrimination, at least in parts of the country. So that we should add Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans. And Asians had obviously suffered a lot of discrimination as well, including exclusion from citizenship and immigration. And so they were just sort of thrown in without much thought. Jews and Catholics were originally considered, but they were put out partly because of the lack of analogy to African Americans, a lack of clear differences in complexion and appearance. But also, one thing that I really didn't emphasize enough in the book, but it's occurred to me as I've been talking to people about the book, is that at the time it was considered offensive, anti-civil rights, anti-egalitarianism, and invitation to discrimination to ask people about their race, to ask people to fill it out. So instead, the way civil rights laws were enforced for the first, let's say, 20 years of the civil rights era, from the early 50s to the early 70s, was visual identification. I'm the employer. I don't know. I don't ask my employees who's Mexican, who's black, who's Asian. I just look at them. And if you're trying to put Jews and Catholics in, that would be a problem because you can't tell by looking. You sometimes can tell by last name, but that's kind of inexact. So for those two reasons, basically any of the white ethnic or religious minorities that could have been included were excluded, and we wound up with, on these government forms, very similar rules to what we have today. We wound up with a white category, what then would have been called a Negro category, which is now the Black African American category, an Oriental category, which is now Asian American category, and classification for Mexican American and Puerto Ricans, which morphed into the Hispanic category. Now, I mentioned Hispanics were originally considered to be white, but but again, Mexican, we added Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and then when the affirmative action program started, they were sort of included. The Ford Foundation sort of made a big project to sort of ensure that Mexican Americans would be organized as a minority group. And then the Hispanic is really kind of a weird category because it's an ethnic officially classification and not racial. And there was a real confusion as how to deal with these folks in terms of government statistics collecting. Should we call them Spanish Americans? Spanish surname? Should we have a separate classification for Mexicans and Puerto Ricans? After all, they live in completely different parts of the country, and they have different backgrounds. Puerto Ricans have more African ancestry. Mexicans have more indigenous ancestry. Should we add Cuban Americans, who are mostly self-identified and look Caucasian white as well? And essentially, this is actually one of the things that led to the government deciding to formalize these classifications.